Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Hello and welcome to another edition of Musical Talk. I'm Thos, and as I have very little in my life, I've once again been wondering what would happen if a simple spelling mistake were to be included in the poster for a musical. We might end up with that most unusual operetta, The Merry Window. Now, sit tight, a series of glass-related jokes are now going to follow. Unfortunately, it's one of those shows which I suspect would not interest the audience very much. They'd glaze over, because the show sounds a bit of a pain. Indeed, probably quite shattering to enjoy, and I suspect for the writers it needs a polish. And I will stop there. Let us turn attention very, very swiftly to much better things than my poor jokes. And today, and indeed next week, we're going to present you with that very much better thing. Because I'm delighted to be able to say that over the next 2 weeks, we're going to be able to talk about a brand new musical which you can watch. Now, I say brand new. The musical is called Runesical, and it is a musical based around Runescape. And I am grateful to my learned clerk who has just thrust this piece of paper in my hands that tells me that Runescape is a popular and long-established online game. Now, I called the show new because it's only a year and a half old, because you may remember that Mike Shapiro and I discussed it as one of the offerings live at last year's Edinburgh Festival Fringe in 2022, and we both very much enjoyed it. And we both enjoyed it from our slightly different positions as well, because Mike does play online games, although not particularly RuneScape, and I don't play online games at all, what with me being an old man. But we both enjoyed the show, so understanding RuneScape is not something you need to have to get enjoyment out of this musical. But if you do play RuneScape, then you'll get even more out of it. There will be in-jokes especially written for you. But the people behind Runesical decided that one of the excellent things they might do, having a hit show on their hands, was to then record it in video form and place it on YouTube. And so it is that the excellent musical Runesical is now available for you and indeed anyone to watch on YouTube. And even better than that, it has retained its make-your-own-adventure structure. So you can watch the show in various chapters, choose how each chapter is going to end, and then follow the path through, which means that once you finish watching it, should you wish to do so, you can go back and follow a different path through the structure of the narrative. It's terribly clever, I think. And, more than that, terribly good. So who are the people behind this show? Well, their names are Sam Cochrane and Alex Prescot, and in just a minute you'll hear the first half of an in-depth conversation I had with them about Runesical and their other musicals, because if those names sound familiar, they were the people behind and involved in Timpson the Musical and Scouts the Musical. We've certainly discussed Timpson the Musical here, and Scouts is a show which I think we're all hoping will be developed further. Sam and Alex have either been involved in those shows or worked with other people. And together, and indeed with other people, they also form Giggle Mug. And as Giggle Mug, they are also great comedy improvisers, including improvised musicals. And that, of course, gives them quite the insight into how to create a musical that lands. And Runesical is certainly one of those. And finally, before we get into the bread and butter of today, they've also been incredibly kind and said that we can play some songs from Runesical, and indeed one from Timpson the Musical, so you can see the breadth of their work. So, what are we going to get today? Well, today, as I say, the first half of that conversation with Sam and Alex. After the conversation ends today, you'll hear a song from Timpson the Musical, and not just a song, my favourite song from that show, A Hole in My Soul. And in just a minute, to usher us into that conversation, we'll hear the opening number from Runesical. So, don't go away. 2 songs, a fabulous interview, and then, of course, some information about how you can see this show online, and indeed Giggle Mug in performance, because they have some shows coming up in the next few months, and you have the recipe for what I hope will be a very excellent episode. So, let's go into that opening number from Runesical.
homies, all my homo sapiens, you ready for a musical that's gonna be Runescapian? We'll take you on a journey from Lumbridge to the wilderness. If it's PvP or PvM, make sure nobody's killing us.
We're gonna commit to the rhymes that we spit. That's why we know this show's gonna be a critical hit.
Yeah, it's the original, not a wannabe.
La-da-da-dee-da.
It's the mother-loaded
MMORPG.
MMORPG.
Break that down.
Yep, for all the noobs. What's a noob? It means newbie. Ha, what a noob.
Means massively mountainous and monstrous, a myriad of maps marking mountains full of monsters.
Now the M. Multiplayer, meaning members multiply. Millions of mortals, more from us to modify.
O, online, on the web, obviously.
RP.
Role-playing, players roll with personality.
And G.
It's a game.
Go schools, gems, gold, goats.
Gynecology? What?
RuneScape.
Escape your ruin and shape your fate. Log on at noon and stay up too late.
As soon as you grab your cape, you'll be there soon.
Landing, please wait. But one problem still remains.
Every player in every game, every hero needs a name. So what's your username?
Lance_054.
What? Really? First 53 taken, were they?
Actually, yeah.
Oh, they were. All right.
054.
Escape your ruin and shape your fate. Log on at noon, stay up too late.
Watch me go, watch this space. Remember my flow, remember my face. Remember my name, man. I'll make it to the top, I'm gonna be the best. And I won't let a lie, cause I'm ready for the quest. I want XP, so I'm gonna run a grind. And I ain't trouble with this, but I'll reach 99.
What's your username?
Lance_054.
Oh, yeah. You did mention.
I'm Sam Cochrane, co-writer of Runesical and artistic director of Gigglemug.
And I'm Alex Prescot, co-writer of Runesical.
And also involved in Gigglemug.
Well, yes, frequent collaborator.
Yeah, regular. Oh yeah, I feel like you've been involved in most productions or projects at this point.
Yeah.
Are you a giggler or a mugger?
Oh, a bit of both. Depends on the day.
I shall phone the police on the latter. But Gigglemug, we need, I think, to talk about what that is, because if you like, that's the platform from which Runesical has flowered. He said, mixing his metaphors terribly, but also is responsible for other musicals. And, I should say, also does other things. You know, the two of you perform, and I appreciate it's a collaborative effort. There's a number of people involved in Gigglemug, but I'm delighted to have two people who I consider to be absolutely the heart of it here.
The core.
But what is Gigglemug? Because people are going to say, what's this? What is this word of which I have no understanding?
Oh sure. Well yeah, actually the word. I mean, I start with the word. Victorian
In the beginning
word.
was the word, I'm told, so we might as well. There's a long precedent.
It's sort of it's a really old-fashioned word, and Susie Dent talks about it a lot as well. I feel like it keeps coming up in her tweets about someone who's always smiling. And we just thought that was a really good sort of subject for, or at least what we do is what we want to do for our audiences, is to make them always smile or leave the audience grinning.
Bring joy.
Yeah, totally. But as far as the shows go, our kind of signature thing, I guess, is comedy musicals about brands in some capacity, whether they partner with us or not. And there's lots of different ways that they partner as well. But that is sort of our main thing, I would say. Although we've got, like you said, other projects as well.
Yeah. But you also improvise, don't you? You know, Gigglemug appears from the outside to be, well, I tell you what it looks like to me. It looks like a comedy group or an improvisational group which has flowered into writing professional musicals. Is that the narrative journey you would recognise? You know, how did it come to be? And then, you know, I want to talk about Runesical in a minute because obviously it's fabulous. And it's one of those rare shows that actually was in Edinburgh in 2022 and people can now see. So obviously this is very much what we want to talk about. But how did we get, you know, what is the long road to Runesical?
It's probably best that you start, and then I'll join in when I join.
Well, yeah, so the company actually started from an improvised musical at my uni, Warwick, where there were four of us and we wrote Timpson, the musical, together. So I think really like the vibe of the company and our specific shows is off the back of improv. And I think you see a lot of comedy musicals kind of say things in very specific ways. Gags are kind of said the same way, and we like to find different ways to say or do anything, and for audience members to have a completely different experience and for us to bounce off them and have that kind of like, I don't know, like a stand-up would, but patter-wise back and forth as well.
I'm going to use the word pantomimic here, not in any negative sense, because I love pantomime, and not within the constraints of the formula of pantomime, but I mean in the sense of that fourth wall breaking, let's do it slightly differently every night. Because I think there's some definitional terms, if I may. I just want to sort of unpack as we go, if that's okay.
Sure.
Because when people talk about improvised musicals, often they talk about, the showstopper model, or Baby Wants Candy, that kind of thing, where, you're in an auditorium as a member of the public, on come your performers and your musicians. Someone says, give us a subject, give us a title. Or, there are variants on this. And then what happens is the performers create something seemingly like alchemy out of that night, and you never see that again. Timpson, if that's the sort of the fruit of your improvised musical, is am I right in saying it's slightly more a case of a devised musical with improv elements within it? Or was it created from that kind of empty black room, shouty audience concept?
Yeah, I mean, it was all scripted, but I think there were moments. I mean, I think you probably remember from when we toured it, there were specific moments. The convention is what I'm thinking of.
That we
actual improv, isn't it?
Yeah, in the show where we'd get 2 words from the audience and then have to pitch that together as an invention, which is kind of an improv game. Yeah, I think the parts that we both played in the tour of all the other characters is quite drawn from and kind of bleeds over into the improvised musical that we do now, where we have different hats and you can multi-role and kind of that kind of frantic sort of, we're putting on that hat and now we're being that character, and the comedy from that as well.
So the improvised musical you're talking about there is the more traditional going into a room and people shouting at you?
So
you do that as well, that's the point.
So kind of
these terms are really important. Otherwise I shall get confused.
So that one kind of came from, we were writing Runesical and then the pandemic hit, and so we were having conversations of, while we're writing this, is there another sort of project that might be a little bit more COVID-proof as well? And so Sam came up with the idea of it based on gossip and getting gossip from the audience and then collaborating with different guests and pianists from Showstopper and Baby Wants Candy, Mischief, Ostentatious. But if the worst were to happen and they get COVID, then we can ask someone else, as has happened.
So real life experiences, but good practical responses to them, actually. That's actually a very clever way of making something out of a terrible situation.
Well, I mean, if it's a scripted show, there's not a lot you can do unless you do some part reshuffling or something.
Or you've got a team of understudies, which, if you're outside of the West End, is less common.
Not going to happen, So I think, that's it with improv. I mean, we haven't even made the show, so people don't know what to expect because, I mean, we don't know what to expect, which is the beauty of that, at least. So it served as a really good sort of, over that year for us to be able to do a theatre show. And it's nice for something really kind of positive to come out of that, because I don't think it would have, I don't know whether we would have made it otherwise. It just seemed like the right time.
Can I ask you a question about creativity, though? Because improvisation is one of those things, as I understand it from people who do it regularly, that has to be sort of kept, you have to keep your tool sharp. In the sense you have to do it, because if you let it go for a few days, then the skill sort of drops off. So you regularly have to do it, just like a sportsman has to regularly practice. Do you find that, and also by keeping that honed as part of your sort of, I think it's bean spillers is the term used for your improvised musical in that sense, isn't it? So did you find that keeping your tool honed for the bean spillers also fed into the creativity of Runesical as you were writing that in parallel? I said that very slowly to make it sound like it was a really important and clever question, but actually it's because I was thinking very slowly.
That is an interesting question. I always think it's more stylistically that we definitely take things. I think when we were writing Runesical, or when Timpson was on as well, I think it was like we were sort of pushing what people would be willing to accept, because I think in the improv world that you create every time, if you say something mad, people would just accept that is what this world is. So the thing that I sort of wanted to do with Timpson, for example, was, what if there's a world where like locks just haven't really existed before, and not even to talk about it much, just be like, this is the world. Because if that was in an improv show, people would just be like, okay, cool. So we're sort of like, okay, can we do that in a scripted thing as well? And I guess that sort of enforces Runesical too. I think we definitely tried things maybe were a bit more experimental. I guess the whole multi-pathway element of it is something that works in an improv capacity, because although not in the filmed version, the way we decide would be from getting audience members on stage and playing a little game or a challenge, or throwing a baguette into the audience and then them
which is
throwing it back at which is reference, and then having them throw it at cast members and stuff. So I think it is like it seems like more of a stylistic choice. I'd say that it's reflective of that. Yeah,
and I think with something like Runesical, you have the benefit of, especially doing it for the whole month in Edinburgh, of honing and having continual conversations of if there is a moment that just hasn't worked for a week, whether it's tweaking or whether it's actually coming up with an alternative, but also with all the audience participation, feeling where and audiences on the weekend might be different from midweek, but kind of feeling where the points you can lean into in an improvised audience, and with an audience member coming on. Often a lot of Sam's stuff was very improvised because you don't know it within a framework, as all improvised musicals are. Kind of, it's not complete carte blanche. You're kind of there's a framework that you're working within.
Well, that was the best piece of understanding I was ever given about improvised musicals in the fullest sense of sort of, the black room musical where the audience shout things out, and the person said to me, and it's so important, I think, to understand this, that every time someone makes a suggestion, you're in fact narrowing the opportunities. So, and that is the purpose for the performers, actually, to narrow it down into a sphere where they can jump onto something, whereas it looks like magic to the audience, because the audience thinks, well, we picked this from nowhere, but actually by having more and more constraints, it's much easier to create a narrative, whereas actually, if the audience didn't respond and you were just expected to go on as, say, a team of 5 performers and perform without any input from the audience, that would be much harder and I suspect much less satisfactory. So ironically, the magic trick is to make something look like nothing. So the audience thinks, that it's been created from nothing, whereas in fact it's been created from something quite relatively narrow. If it's set in New York in 1950 and it's called A Streetcar Named Fred, then there's limited, you've immediately narrowed it down,
sure.
And you've got to have a prop of a nose bag for a horse. But, actually it sounds random and weird, but that world is much more tangible now that I've described it.
Yeah.
In 3 sentences.
I think it's probably more like because then obviously with improv people always ask what of that had you practiced, or what songs did you reword for that or whatever, and obviously the answer for us is literally everything is entirely improvised, everything is made up on the spot. And also maybe more so than, I know some improv groups have formulas and ways that they will start a show, or they'll kind of think, okay, you're going to play this sort of character in that, or
framework it or something.
But because we have guests every time, we literally can't, because we can only throw so much at them and be like, okay, this is the kind of the vibe that we're after. I just don't think we'd be able to give them any more guidelines than that, even if we wanted to. But I think that also sets up the sort of dynamic for Runesical as well, because people are always interested in the mechanics of how that show works.
Because it's a choose-your-own-adventure show. That's the point we should say here. Runesical, it has a structural point.
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you there, but for anyone listening, they might say, well, what makes Runesical so different? Well, it's the fact that actually you see it on 2 different days, you get 2 different shows. It might have a similar start.
We did have someone, we had a number 1 fan who came 3-4 times, and ended up seeing very similar shows at least.
Sometimes and some are literally chance.
Yeah,
of course.
And it was odd because at the Fringe, there were some. I remember, so there's one pathway which is either the Mountain Dungeons or the Wilderness, and for some reason, and it is purely random because it's audience members. For this, we got 2 people on stage and said, how many people do you think are playing old school RuneScape, which is sort of the game, the version of the RuneScape that the show's based on, as we speak. And for some reason, it was always the person that was representing the Mountain Dungeons that won it. And I feel like we did, in comparison, we probably did 25 shows. I feel like 20 of those were the Mountain Dungeons, and only 5 were. So
it's a strange because there were some that you could think, if we and some we tweaked, because it seemed weighted, and actually it was a movement that an audience member was having to do. If we tweaked it to be slightly smaller, people were more willing to do that movement. So that meant,
interesting.
so there were
Right.
little things where it was like, we unconsciously, we're not trying to bias any of the paths, but even by saying, do this movement if you want this path, if it was a big movement, they might feel shyer on stage.
How interesting.
So it's sort of the opposite of Darren Brown, because like
Uninfluential.
I imagine he wants specific answers out of people, whereas we don't. We want it to be as fair as possible, because obviously we rehearsed all these different versions of these scenes and songs, and we want to be able to do them all, and we want them to be like fresh in our heads as well. We don't want to go like 10 shows without doing a song.
Yeah.
So it was like Alex said, it was finding ways to make it as fair as possible, or there was no bias at all, and have people just able to at least come up with all the different pathways they could.
It's interesting how people can be influenced. I mean, that's really interesting, because the audience is such an important part of any show, but in Runesical particularly, because you're doing that fourth wall breaking thing. The idea that they can be inadvertently directed, without realising it, or until you realise that you can't stop it, is actually quite fascinating. So you changed the gesture, shall we say, and did it make the difference? Did you find that the wilderness became more common?
So it was the items.
Oh,
choosing
the sand,
which item to
rod,
sand,
and
rod or horn.
Horn,
Do you remember
thank you,
the?
yes.
Do you remember the rap?
Yes. Oh gosh, yeah.
So it was basically a version of rock paper scissors, where it was.
Okay, I think it was horn beats sand, because you can scoop it with your hand.
Sand beats horn. Rod beats horn. You can fish it till the morn.
Logically stacking up so far.
Sand beats rod. You caught dirt, not a cod. That's rod, horn, sand. Do you understand? I think that was it.
Great.
So it was like, I haven't done that since the Fringe. But it was that, and actually that was probably my favourite thing that we couldn't do in the filmed version. Like that was such a fun little idea, and one that people got involved
got to be
with
live,
really well.
hasn't it?
Yeah, totally. But yeah, it was, and so for that one, what you're saying, it was like, I think it was rod. It was the rod. We had a specific action for it, and then we changed that action to have more, try and get it so that it didn't stick out so much, or we didn't want anyone to be more memorable than another one. We wanted them all to be like equally
and
memorable.
equally fun to do as well, because it was like we were thinking, is that action? And there is also, since read up on rock paper scissors and how you can get inside someone's head and always win, and you have to go for, if you draw, you go for what would it be? So you got to go really down the rabbit hole of choices, and but there is all this theory.
You blow my mind on a number of fronts, but that's possibly the one that's.
But that's the interesting thing, was that we didn't know you could do any of this influencing before we were doing it, and then
so you saw it.
Yeah, it was a case of just like, this keeps happening. How do we not let this keep happening? Whereas our jobs would have been a lot easier if we had just let it keep happening, because we'd just be doing the same show every night. But
this is game theory and gamesmanship together, isn't it?
Yeah,
to a degree.
It was a fun challenge as a show. I guess it is in itself. It's like playable theatre, which is intrinsically linked to video gaming. So it was fun in that sense to do a show about a video game, and for like the actual show to be made up like a video game as well. That's sort of what we were going for, I guess, or at least have some freedom for the audience to play it.
Well, let's start with the origins of Runesical then, if I may, because we've sort of established that, you're multi-talented in a number of different areas, but so far we've established that you can improvise a musical in your bean-spilling mode, which is, on the night, completely unplanned. Then there's the devised improvisation, or devised and improvised, of Timpson, shall we say. And you were saying in Timpson, oddly, you had this situation of wanting to create a world that was 1 degree turned away from the real one, where, as you say, locks hadn't been invented, but it was recognisably sort of Victorian and innovative. You can recognise a Victorian London in that, if not the Victorian London, but it's a surreal London where some things exist and some things don't. So it's a take on reality. But ironically, therefore, the 3 of the shows we're talking about today, Runesical seems to be the one that's tied more closely to a format, because obviously it rises from the game, and the game has, I know it's a world game, but even within a world game there are formats and quests. There are things which we associate with that. It looks to me that actually almost your trajectory is the complete reverse of what I would have expected. But actually you've started off with improvisers and you're getting narrower and narrower. That sounds like a criticism. I'm talking about in terms of the product material for your works, your art.
Yeah, You go for it.
Yeah, I was going to say, I definitely think about that. If you innovate, if you are super original across everything, across structure, form, and then it can be quite a lot. So actually, I think we've talked about being selective because we knew the multi-pathway stuff was going to be, I guess, the innovative part or the main part. That then narrative-wise, it's fairly hero's quest and kind of an archetypal quest narrative, which pays homage to kind of what it is and the source material. But kind of, and with some twists and turns thrown in along the way, but kind of thinking, that choosing where, okay, we're going to push this as kind of, this is the originality of it, and having the double world as well in Runesical of the in-game and out-of-game as well. We thought, okay, this is kind of feels juicy, so therefore, if we then...
throw in another dynamic.
They all
Lost don't exist in this world as well.
It's kind of like, it just goes off. Well, you're talking some improv schools about Crazy Town, and kind of if it's not grounded at all, if it's too much weird, we're kind of off with no rules and where do we find where we are? Whereas if you innovate on certain things but keep the rest of it grounded, that can be more satisfying as an experience.
I agree with that's interesting. I can think of two parallels in art immediately on that. One is oddly the Marx Brothers. When the Marx Brothers were making their films in the 1930s, all musicals incidentally, so I feel legitimately able to talk about them. Harpo Marx, who was a silent character, plays the harp, ironically, or non-ironically, actually plays it very well, but hence his name. But Salvador Dali, the great surrealist, was an enormous fan of Harpo Marx and wanted to speech Marx work with him. I don't think it was right, but we wanted to create surrealism with Harpo Marx, who was an exponent of kind of film surrealism. But film surrealism can only actually be taking the normal and moving it slightly because for comic effect, whereas actually you wouldn't really argue, I think, that Dali is comic. And Dali then created a harp covered in spoons and various other things for Harpo Marx, which sound like really fabulous ideas, but don't have a comic function. So they don't serve the art that Harpo was working. So that it couldn't be used, interestingly. I think it's that concept of actually, how far do you take the road you're taking? And I really like that. And the other one I can think of is there's a play called Travels of My Aunt, which is an adaptation of a Graham Greene novel. And it's one of these things where a central character is played by one actor, but there are three other actors who play all the other characters. And it works very successfully, and it's been running around now since the late 90s, I think. It's periodically revived in this production. And I was talking to a man who'd written Mr. Ben, the children's programme musical. And he does the same thing there. The actor who plays Mr. Ben is the central character, and all the other characters are played by 3 or 4 people. It's a tradition we understand, but he was saying you have to have one character who doesn't change. It's the lodestone around which all the other characters. So you've got some kind of anchor, I suppose is where we're going.
And we had that with... I think with both Timpson and Runesical to an extent, where with Timpson, we're like 4 characters who will always...
Don't change.
Yeah. And then 2 are our characters who would multi-role. And then with Runesical, it really is 3 characters who kind of stay the same, and then 4-ish who multi-role as well. So I guess there is a...
Lance, your central character, for example, is only played by one actor. And he doesn't play anything else.
I think actually that is true. I think the 2 other lead characters, the Odin character and the Pearl character, they only really play those characters, but they also are ensemble as well.
Yes,
so I
course.
guess, but Lance is probably the only one that is completely Lance the whole way.
And kind
through.
of once they come on as their main character,
they stick
Odin
in
and Pearl,
stick
in.
in.
So it's kind of before when they haven't been defined as this character, then they can kind of help. We're a cast of 7 trying to play. How many characters are there? So,
I don't even
a
know.
lot. I would argue. And different on different nights, of course.
Well,
Possibly,
yes,
potentially.
Oh yeah, 100%. Characters just waiting in the wings.
You see, that's really interesting to me. So I like this idea that actually you recognise that the structure it can't be too way out and wacky, oddly, because you lose people. So once again, we keep coming back to this idea that oddly, and this sounds so counterintuitive, that within improvisation, structure is all.
Yeah.
I mean, you wouldn't ever write that down, would you, if you weren't thinking about it?
Well, I think it's when, as far as whenever we do rehearse for improv, I think that is generally the reminder that we do. It is all structural stuff or character-based stuff, mainly structure, I'd say, to be honest. And because I think then you really then have free reign to do whatever you like, having a sort of base to come back to, or at least knowing our story is always following like the classic 5-act structure, and just being aware of that, and time marking in our heads where those moments are as well, so that then you can, in the scenes, you can do whatever the hell you want, knowing that you're coming back to something.
Well, let's go back to showstoppers. I mean, in Edinburgh they're on for an hour like everyone, or whatever it is, but they know that they've got to get that narrative to some kind of a conclusion at the end, and very often the narrative is the least important part of it. It is actually it's a conveyor belt that takes you from scene A to scene B, where the interaction within the characters is where the audience responds, the fun is. But they know that they can't go on forever. Even if you're mining a particularly good comic scene, you've got to stop, and you must find this as well. So it is exactly as you say. The narrative, oddly, is essential but not central. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And what I'd say about Runesical as well is that the very first time I kind of spoke to, or at least saw people that work at Jagex, who make the game Runescape, in person, they gave me like a sort of PowerPoint doc. Do you remember this? Of like, these are our rules, and it's what they give all the people that make quests in their games, so that it's all cohesive. And for us, it was like coming back with at least using that as a means of, okay, this is the base level, this is what the reality of the world is, and not to stray too far from that, to at least make gamers happy. So that was also
the basics,
sort of
in fact.
That was kind of a defining feature of it too, or at least something that brought it back and grounded it.
So, as I say, Runesical's had two major iterations: live in Edinburgh in 2022, and now a recorded version which people can see on YouTube. In a way, we haven't really touched on how did Runesical start in your heads. You mentioned it came up as you were writing it before COVID, I think. Is that correct?
Yeah, so it was actually when we were touring Timpson, or towards the end of that run. I think I'd actually already started Scouts.
Which is your other musical.
But I knew that at least at that stage I didn't want to take it to the Fringe. I wanted Scouts to be kind of a different thing to our Fringe shows. And I really wanted to do a fantasy show, I really wanted to do a video game show, and I really wanted to do a multi-pathway show. And then I think it was just a case of, I actually didn't know that RuneScape was UK based. It's a nice coincidence that every kind of brand we've worked with has been from the UK. But yeah, and
I look forward to Hovis the musical.
I've thought of it. It's all like I've thought of, honestly, so many different brands and things, and what could work. But yeah, and then I think I just called up you to say, do you know RuneScape, and would you be interested?
You hadn't played growing up, but I had played quite a lot growing up, so we kind of had the two sides, which
But
I think
that's brilliant.
Which we
sorry,
I was going to say that we more or less maintained of, you played it kind of minimally, and I got back into it.
Are you still playing it now?
And then I'm not at the moment.
Currently dormant.
Currently on hiatus, but then I was on hiatus. I got really into it when we were writing it, because
your family,
I got my family back into it as well, because we'd all kind of, I think we discovered doing it that there was kind of was it 2007 was when it was at its most widespread. So there's still the die-hard fans playing it, and there's two main different versions now. But kind of that kind of hit when we were teenagers, essentially. So it was the perfect time. So most people that we know played or had heard of it, but it was quite a specific pocket. But yeah, kind of going back to play it then, when we were writing it, I could be saying, oh, actually, this is the point in the game, and Sam could be saying, well, if you don't play the game, that won't matter, or that might alienate people who don't play the game, and also, but the people that play it will love it. So
I think the one that,
finding that balance,
Easter eggs as well.
Totally. The one that stayed in particularly that is proper RuneScape lore, I think, is
LAW or LORE?
LORE. Although it feels like the law sometimes. Is that when you are picking the items, how you get from one place to another. So, for example, if you go to get the sand first, afterwards you'll go and get the rod, and so it's a lot. It's confusing.
It's also a perfect outtake, if I may say.
No.
Once I got the sound, I got the horn.
And for the way that you could do that in game was because
you go to the shanty pass,
yeah.
and then if you say you're an outlaw in the game, you get put in the jail in Port Sarim, which is where you need to go for the rod. So we put that in-game logic so that people that have played the game would say, that's an actual thing.
Yeah.
But for everyone else, it's kind of, that's just something that you can accept.
And indeed, as a non-game player at all, not even just RuneScape, I'm just too old. I wouldn't have picked that up in a million years. But, but speaking narratively, I was able to follow it, and it coheres, and that ultimately you want that to be the case.
That's the thing. Yeah, I think although there are Easter eggs, and I think it's more just the fact, it's more like a recognition thing.
Yeah.
Like you see the cook's assistant character who is based on the kind of first proper quest in RuneScape.
Is she the one who wants to make pudding for the Duke or the cake for the Duke?
Yes,
quite.
So you've got that. You've got like Bob the Cat, for example, or the Drunken Dwarf, who will get a reaction from the audience, and that's kind of how it, I guess, exists in the world of RuneScape.
But can I say also, just briefly to give you an outsider's point of view on that, the Drunken Dwarf, who I enjoyed very much, but is dressed in your production not unlike a Valkyrie. So she looks Wagnerian to me. And of course, Wagnerian stuff isn't so very far from the world of fantasy. I can absolutely imagine a Valkyrie turning up in... so because she has a lament. Well, not a terribly long one, but she has a lament. I quickly realised that she was a character who meant something. But just on first vantage point, I thought, here's Votan and a Valkyrie kind of thing.
I think that's it. It's like the nice thing about using those characters or being selective about which ones we used was the fact that they could all exist in the world of Gielinor. To be honest, like a cook asking you to get some ingredients for a cake, it still serves the purpose of this is a rubbish quest.
Yes, that came across.
But whilst also being a real thing.
Yeah, I think also because there's enough in the game, because there's, especially if you remember, there's hundreds of quests and it's been going for so long that
I imagine one is the reason for the other.
And so a lot of the time we could see, let's see what's actually there. And then the Mirror Dragon we invented as kind of a take on, it's even more powerful than all the dragons that already exist, having like an original quest, so that people... And also it's a sense of if you take something from within the game, you kind of are bound to what are the expectations of that? Whereas if you invent something, you're then extending that. But you can play with that within that. I think people understand you've taken the essence of that character.
Yeah, and the freaky troll, for example, who is a lot of
isn't in the game.
Favourite.
Guilty as charged.
And that's an example of there are lots of trolls in the game, so let's make one that's a bit weird.
Let's go back to the Mirror Dragon. I hadn't realised that Mirror Dragon wasn't actually a proper RuneScape thing, but what I thought was rather splendid about it was that, of course, what Runesical is, if you like, is almost a mirror held up to the RuneScape game and reflected into a musical. So I actually took it in that kind of almost literal sense. That this was, parody is not the right word, but through a glass darkly kind of thing option. So I actually thought you were being terribly... and indeed I still do believe you were being incredibly clever.
Please read into whatever.
And self-referential.
And make it sound clever. I won't reveal for anyone listening who hasn't seen and wants to watch. I don't know if you remember this, but there is a reason why the Mirror Dragon is called Mirror Dragon, and we can discuss it off air.
It's an enigma just waiting to be discovered, surely.
But there's lots of little, and the Cave of Deception and that sort of thing. We made things for I guess more thought has gone into it than
and with lots of, and I think that where we see that is in lots of the songs. There were lots of references that we talked about, and it's very references on its sleeve. And sometimes we'd forgotten where the reference was, and then, in a review the other day, someone picked up on the alphabet rap in the original
remix,
one. And that was where it was referenced. And we're not kind of shy or coy about those references. I don't think
because I think for example, Hamilton has so many different references to musicians from the 90s other musicals as well.
6 is entirely based on it.
Well,
and if you don't, and if when I first saw it, you don't recognise who the parodies are of, it still works, but it works less satisfactorily.
And and I think it is although you're kind of taking something from somewhere else, it is skill in some
it
some sort of sense.
Oh gosh,
to
it really is.
To make it fit in.
I think also had people say, "Oh, were you inspired by this?" And we weren't at all. Like, there definitely been lots of ones like, "Oh, you were playing that character like that." And I was like, "Oh, I get why you think that."
But flavours and resonances are one of the extras that you get just from putting on a good piece. You know, if there's craft in one, actually that's going to resonate in some way with another show that has similar craft, even if it's not come from the same source.
It's very cool to see.
I'm fighting not to say Minecraft as we're in the world of games here as well.
Yeah. No, it's great to see. We love seeing people interpret it in maybe a different way than we had imagined, or kind of find something in it that we didn't notice that also makes sense. Like, that's really cool that it was sort of just random, but that people can pick up on it. And I think especially now that it's living online, people can rewatch and notice things, and there are a lot of references and Easter eggs, and I'd be surprised if anyone found them all, but I would love to see people
even
try.
us, because there are Easter eggs that we didn't even intend.
Well, I'm going to ask you a little later, actually, what the audience might be teaching you and has told you. But I still want to, because, you know, forgive me, as you say, people will see things which you won't have put in, but are there nonetheless. But I still want to go back. Forgive me, I'm determined to get this line through, which is that you delighted on RuneScape as the Sourcewheel musical. And presumably at that stage it was definitely going to be a physical musical. You know, you were going to presumably take it to Edinburgh, as indeed you ultimately did.
Yeah.
So how did it crystallise? You said you had this idea that you wanted to do something in gaming, that something had a build your own adventure, that, you know, there were various things you wanted to do, and you identified, if you like, RuneScape, and between the two of you, that's where you were going. What then, I suppose? Leave it nice and open.
As in, how do we actually start?
Yeah, because forgive me, there's a couple of things here. You know, when I keep mentioning this, but it's worth mentioning, before computer games and, you know, the idea of you've got choices. In the 1980s, there was a series of choose your own adventure books, and I had them. You know, I had those. You know, do you run down the corridor? Do you not run down the corridor? And they were quite blunt. You know. Normally it would channel you only through one story, because, you know, the running down the corridor thing, you know, if you say, yes, I will run down the corridor, it says, hooray, you've survived, and you move on to the next bit. And if you say, no, I don't, it says, you have been eaten by the monster, start again. So there wasn't too much of a second world. But you can structure these in different ways. And it seems to me that if you've chosen... Sorry, I'm talking too much, but it seems to me that if you've got that... I'm not going to use the word gimmick, but if the conceit is it's got to be a choose your own adventure for an audience... That's quite different from a computer game, obviously. How do you factor that into the cooking pot of writing a musical?
I think we were both...
For the Duke.
I think we were both very clear about structurally how we wanted to do it, because I can actually think of two other multi-pathway video game musicals. I can think of other multi-pathway musicals. I can't think of any that have done it like we have, which is why we wanted to do it, really. But this idea, and we were talking about it before, about you're presented with an option, either go left or right. You have a completely different experience whichever way you go, and then you come back to some sort of linear story after that. That was kind of the shape of it, and you keep doing that. You keep going out and in and going to different places.
And we talked about having the other multi-pathway stuff we'd seen, and what we did like and what we didn't like, and we came back to choices that matter and have consequences, because I think we both have a bit of a bugbear of when you find, well, occasionally we do it as a joke, or like some things, but the majority of the choices having consequences, and as opposed to it being like, oh, actually, let's go back. I think we were very clear with our one that we never wanted to go back. And it never wanted to be like, oh, game over, do you want to restart?
Well, also,
it was, we're keeping going.
At the Fringe as well, like you get charged every minute that you spend to go over.
So I guess that was
that's a real factor I hadn't even considered. Yes, you've still got to get it into the 50-minute slot, haven't you?
And I don't think we ever really... I think we sort of wrote them having a rough idea that they would be similar lengths, and actually seeing them online now, they are all... I mean, there might be like 30 seconds in it between the different ones, but generally very similar.
You mean, let's say during chapter 4, the two options, one might be 8 minutes and one might be 8.5 minutes. You mean they do come in? Yes, they do. Yes.
And thankfully it sort of did just work out like that. Though we never, we never ran over.
And that was actually one that at the start, going to the mountain dungeons was shorter than going to the wilderness. And then had the idea. There's a singing part of it for anyone who hasn't seen it.
It's a musical.
That came, maybe with an audience member.
Oh yes, of course.
Singing. But that was a later addition, and I don't know whether that came from. We definitely realised they were a different length, and also because I think it's having the different choices that you want them to be equally good but not the same as well. So
Indeed.
being like, oh, they've got to have different offers, but have, you know, like levels of interaction or levels of lyricism or whatever. You want them to be like similar levels of pleasure, I guess.
And I think that was the most important thing really for us was to say what you were saying about like not going back and, you know, starting again. But crucially, we wanted there to be, I mean, almost purely like partly from a marketing perspective as well. We wanted people to go away and you physically cannot see every song,
No.
you know, or every scene. It's a reason to come back, but also it just means that you are getting you've sort of earned an experience and it's yours, and
It's tailored in a way to that audience.
and I mean, I kind of said earlier about someone kind of getting very similar shows, but actually in reality, I don't think you could ever, the way that it was all the different choices layered up, I don't think you could ever get the same show exactly.
Yeah. One of my favourite things in Edinburgh was that the wizard character had a different name every day.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we could tell when people had seen it because they would come up to us and say, "Oh, Magic Mike."
That was
Or
Monday.
They would say, yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
So you could kind of tell where people, and that gave it a different flavour. And then because there's certain stuff that with a limited amount of time to film. It can't be so tailored because
Of course,
all the,
yeah.
but certain things of like when you were coming on, you could make references to the name of that day and kind of with those kind of mini things that just make it feel like it's tailored for you.
Yeah.
Yes, layered and tailored is really interesting, isn't it? It is that, because and when you're doing it live, particularly as improvisers, you've also got an audience in the palm of your hands. You know how to do that, which some wouldn't be in a position to do. But you're quite right. You've also got to boil it down a little bit for the film version. It has to be. I suppose it has to, because it can't be so improvised because it's film rather, even though it's a live recording we're watching.
Yeah.
And also we want the audience at home to feel the control over the choices.
Yeah.
So there are certain choices in the film that were made live with the live audience, but we want the majority of the home person to have the choices. So therefore,
And do it more than once.
we can't necessarily, you know, riff off the choice that someone at home has made.
They had to sort of live alone.
Yeah, whereas you could live. So it's just different about like.
And going back to the Darren Brown mind tricks, we realised that we always needed Lance to have the same coloured hat, basically. And we were like, okay, let's go. The reason we went with yellow and how we did it was it was always the third hat that was an option, and it wasn't a fix at all. It was just people always would woo the loudest for that one. So it was a way of like guaranteeing that, so that, for example, he wouldn't be in a scene with a yellow hat and then in another scene with an orange hat.
For the
course,
filmed version.
For the film
Even because
version,
it's filmed over several nights, isn't it?
over
in order to allow you the
4
options.
different shows.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but you're right. Certain continuity has to be maintained, which isn't so. Yes.
It is, it's an interesting one, the continuity side
But
of
it's
things.
interesting. So you're saying that the audiences nearly always went for the last colour.
Yeah, but they'd not. I don't think it wasn't the case at the Fringe at all. I think I think it was different hats and that sort in general. But I can't remember. Maybe it was a different order in which we said them. Then
Did you do a big gesture? You know.
Yeah, I think it was
Orange,
just
purple,
yeah, exactly. But this time round, it was
More
just
people get comfortable with
they realised
responding.
what they're doing.
responding exactly. And
You've got to give an audience license to speak, and once they feel they've got it, they will. But they don't at the beginning. You know, British audiences now.
And Fringe audiences, it's interesting doing it in Edinburgh versus doing it in Cambridge, and how and we thought about that at the beginning of the show, that kind of the first ask fors, if you will, the first audience interaction is opt-in from the audience, because if the first one or it's kind of a closed question, which we think about a lot with improv, of kind of what you're asking for. It's why with stand-up comedy with crowd work, it's what do you do or what's your name. It's things that you know how to answer that, as opposed to something broad as the first question. People
is there
will
a god? Would be harder.
Exactly.
It's
Whereas
harder
you can
than
gradually get them to is there a god, but it takes.
But you've got to
a
start
while
with what's your favourite colour. Yeah.
Exactly.
And I think that is why it's such a good device. I think audience participation, I completely get why it scares people. I hate being in the audience when there's audience participation.
Sorry, can I just say, you hate being in the audience, so you went on the stage.
It's so, well, of course, the opposite of that. But when there is an option of getting someone on stage, I will absolutely do everything I can to not be that person. Despite almost every show we do, it is a feature. Because it's such a good device for relaxing an audience and getting them on your side.
Oh,
And
indeed, yeah.
In Scouts, our other show that we did recently, it was a different sort of audience participation because we got a certain amount of audience members on stage to compete in the kind of central conceit of the show, which is the Scout Games, which is sort of like a fictional scouting event, like Jamboree meets Olympics sort of thing. And it was a very different way of doing it, and we found that like as soon as, if the audience was a bit cold at the start, as soon as you get people up on stage, whether it's because it's them laughing out of relief that it's not them, or because they know that person, or because they just think it's funny in general, it's a way of just getting people on side straight away. And similarly with this as well, we're having so much interaction and back and forth with audience members. It's just a really good device, and something with our fourth wall breaking style that works really well.
And we talk a lot about pre-show as well. I love being on stage before and chatting to everyone. And Sam doesn't.
You're the warm-up.
No, well, I'm often not. I often make sounds.
It's always, I'm for some reason always the character that has to have patter with the audience.
Yeah, so in Runesical Live, Sam was on stage as people came in, because that again just kind of, if you've had a conversation with them to start with, then people are just more primed for, this is going to be a sort. And if you're nice to them, obviously, crucially.
But also, Sam, you play the wizard character, who is essentially the only real character of authority.
Yeah.
You're the one who can step in as well. So So I suppose actually being there to begin with gives you, as I say, you're reacting with an audience to help the audience, but presumably it also solidifies your role in the piece.
Yeah, I'd say so. I think it's very similar as well to in Timpson, when I mainly played Mr. Timpson, whatever you want to call him, which is the portrait character.
Yeah, but talking narrative.
I also
role,
did that. Yeah, I also did that at the start of the show, where I was talking to people as they came in, and I have to say I much preferred being the wizard than the portrait. It was much harder to start up a conversation about Timpson, I think, than about video games in general. So I would definitely relax into it. But now, and we also do it in the Bean Spillers. We're on stage talking to people as they come in. Yeah, I'm not personally. I love a pre-show, but I hate knowing everyone that's in. I'd rather just, but you know.
Can I just talk about that portrait thing in Timpson, though? I tell you what, it was interesting because, I mean, I know, Alex, later in the show that you also assume the role of the portrait, but at the beginning, you do that thing where you're holding the portrait, so it's portrait as a puppet, because you're operating the articulated mouth as you speak, but the audience can see you speaking, so you're not using it as a ventriloquist thing, but it's that Avenue Q thing, if you like it, so people can see you operating the portrait, whereas the other way of doing it would have been to have held up the portrait as your head and hidden behind it. So it's important actually to be seen. I assume that was a deliberate choice.
I actually think so it was also interesting that I played slightly different characters on the tour of Timpson to the first iteration at the Fringe. And I think Chris, who I co-wrote the book with for Timpson, plays Mr. Timpson in that version. I think it was, and I think he did hold it in front of his face. I think it was also, I think it maybe was just our different takes on it. I quite like the idea of, I don't know, people being able to see you. I don't want anything to be lost, and especially with
in that heightened world it works.
Totally, I think so.
And I think it's the joy of often what where you get and with improv, the part of the joy is seeing, there are the different styles, but definitely with Bean Spillers, of seeing that it's a bit tricky and we're having to,
problem solving live.
Yeah, exactly. And people enjoy, I think, seeing that. And so, I think in all the shows there's kind of a, that kind of seeing the mechanics and seeing a little bit behind the machine, but not all of it. Kind of, I think. Yeah,
people like seeing us and we like showing off when things that go wrong, or when we're actually struggling to do elements of the show. Or I think that's it's great. I think allowing your mistakes to actually fully be a part of the show and to let that be a part of that audience's experience.
How are they going to get out of that is a very appealing thing to watch. It may not be so much fun to be in.
And obviously we don't want to continuously make mistakes. We want to make it as professional as we can. But it is just part of it. Sometimes people do. And I think the fun thing about our vibe is that you can just poke fun at whatever just happened on stage. Whereas a lot of, I suppose, musicals, more serious musicals, maybe in Les Mis, if a win
can
falls
there
off
be a
or
more
something,
serious musical than Runesical?
Maybe. You don't have that same freedom, which is fun.
Musical talk.
Mum won't let me follow my dream. I want to be part of something bigger. I want to invent. I'm sick of sandals. I'm livid with loafers. I'm flipped off with flip-flops. I hate shoes. Oh, I hate shoes. I hate shoes. Laces, lining, tongue and top piece. Aglet, eyelid, arch and throat line. Insole, outsole, heel and toe cap. Fine. Which direction do you go when your life is tight around the toe? Which direction do you choose? Yeah, when you want to be in another's shoes. How can you avoid a scandal when you're as useful as Achilles' sandal? How can you avoid a mishap when you're on a tightrope in steel toe caps? Laces, lining, tongue and top piece. Aglet, eyelid, arch and throat line. Insole, outsole, heel and toe cap. There's a hole in my soul and it's taking me off beat. I think I've lost control. You can't dance with two left feet. Oh, what's going on in my shop?
From the 90s! Laces, lining, tongue and top piece. Aglet, eyelid, arch and throat line. Insole, outsole, heel and toe.
It wasn't my intent for this desire to invent, to prevent me from my ascent. Through giving 100%, I just gotta vent and lament the pent-up feeling that my life has been misspent. Save me from this torment. Ever since I was young, I was prevented from getting farther because of the absence of my father. He took his brogues, went rogue, won't pay the debt he owed. His son abandoned. He did what he always planned and left us on a shoestring. But here's the thing. The only trace he left about this place was a singular shoelace. There's a hole in my soul. I think I've lost control. There's a hole in my soul and it's taking me off beat. I think I've lost control. You can't dance with, you can't dance with, you can't dance with two left feet.
And there we are, the song from Timpson the Musical, A Hole in My Soul. And what a wonderful song that is, and wonderfully performed. And before that, of course, you heard that conversation with Alex Prescot and Sam Cochrane. Part 2 of that next week, so please do listen again. It was a great conversation in great company, and they are fabulous chaps. And I look forward to seeing more of their work in the future. And of course, before we started that interview, we heard the opening number from Runesical. So, how can you see Runesical? It's a terribly good question, and I'm very pleased that you asked it. Well, the easiest thing to do is go along first to their website, gigglemugcomedy.com. And there you can find out more about Runesical, and indeed the other musicals which are in their portfolio, which is Timpson the Musical, the Beanspillers Improvised Musical, and Scouts the Musical. And if you fancy seeing Alex and Sam and sometimes special guests in their improvised musical, in their capacity as Gigglemug, you can do so, because they're appearing at the Rondo Theatre in Bath on the 24th and 25th of November, and then at the Hen and Chickens Theatre in London on the 26th of November. And there are more dates constantly being announced, so if you can't make those performances, keep an eye on their website to see if there's going to be any others near you. They are worth seeing in all their forms. And, of course, they're worth hearing. And I would recommend that you choose to do so by tuning in to our next episode, when we hear the second part of that conversation and 2 more songs from the Runesical score. But most of all, do go along and see if you can watch Runesical on YouTube. I think you'll enjoy it. If you like silly, engaging and imaginative musical theatre, you really can't do very much better than seeing Runesical. So, with that ringing in your ears and settling in your memory, I say let's bring this episode to an end, and so I invite you to join us again next week, or whenever, for another episode of Musical Talk. Until then, it only behoves me, what a wonderful word, to say goodbye. And having really introduced the fact that I'm going to do so, it will now come as no surprise when I do use that to finish the episode. But why not? I am a lover of tradition, and that is one. So here goes. Goodbye. This episode of Musical Talk, edited and presented by Thos Ribbits. Copyright Musical Talk 2023, except for the songs where the copyright remains with the original creators. And my thanks go to them for allowing me to play their wonderful songs in this episode. To find out more about the world of Musical Talk and listen to past episodes, go along to our website www.musicaltalk.co.uk or subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and follow us on the usual social media networks like Facebook, Instagram and X, formerly known as Twitter. And if you want to follow me on the latter, you can. At Musical Talk Thos.
Yeah, it's interesting. We've got it's interesting, like getting involved in a community of people who don't necessarily like theatre, or especially musicals, or know of it.
I saw some of your tweets.
Oh yeah, there are some really interesting responses to it. What is nice is that on the actual YouTube channel, it's like all the people who want to watch it are watching it. But when it's just on a social.
Just the idea of it. It's more than the actual.
But interesting. I don't know if it's a gamer thing specifically, but people just feeling the urge that they have to say something about it, whether they like it or not. It's like they just have to get involved in some capacity to talk about it, which has definitely been an interesting experience, and one that we didn't have with Tipson, because there aren't any Tipson
groupies.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Very different beast in that sense.
I love my keys.
Yeah.
I quite like the ones that are like, this really isn't for me, but I hope someone enjoys it.
Yeah.
One of them.
You don't need to say that.
Oh, that's really nice.
Up to a point,
no, fair enough of being like, wow, I hate this, but someone won't.
Yeah.